what I've picked up on in talking with pastoral leaders that are out there in the field, we need to measure impact beyond what we are actually offering. And what I mean by that is this: I am burdened, Scott, recently from my travels in asking the question to what extent what you're offering is making a transformative impact. Another way of asking the question is, are you doing what you really think you're doing with your materials and your teaching?
Hello, and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. Something's wrong with this picture. I'm your only host today. Alex Kochman is somewhere else. I'll let him explain what he's doing. I think he's snowed in or they're sicked in, but I get the privilege of hosting the show today, and we're glad to have you wherever you're tuning in from as we talk about things that matter to global missions. And we're excited this morning, it's morning where I'm at, to have a guest that I think is really important to talking about theological education. So I want to introduce for us Dr. Michael Ortiz. He's the director of the International Council for the Evangelical Theological Training. He's also VP for Global Ministries and associate professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. And so Michael, welcome to the show. Good to have you on here. Did I get everything right about what you're currently doing?
I think you got it pretty much right. Yeah, it's actually not evangelical theological training; it's education at the end. So it's ISET. So that's just a little minor correction, but you scored about 98%.
I was so close.
There, so.
I even had it right in my notes, but see, this is why we need Alex, because Alex gets all those little details right.
You're doing great. Yeah, doing great. It's good to be with you, Scott. Thanks for the invitation. We're going to miss Alex today, but we'll make it fly nevertheless, right?
The truth is, when Alex gets on the show, and we can talk about him because he's not even going to listen to this. He just likes to throw in Latin phrases and try to make it seem more intellectual than what it needs to be. And so, the truth is, you and I, we can go on just fine without him. We'll say we missed him, but we won't. We'll in practice, it'll be just fine. So tell us a little bit about your ministry. I know that you were in law, then you got into theology and missions training. So explain that kind of path. What led you from practicing law to going into training ministers from all over the world?
Yeah, I came to Christ in my early 30s, and I was an attorney then, and really focused in on what the world was to offer for me and for my family. And that radically shifted my thinking about what was of value, knowing now Christ. And then we ended up actually starting a church as brand new believers. My wife and I came to Christ at the same time. So we started a church in Florida where we're from. And from there, the Lord just continued to challenge me in the area of teaching and training. And one thing led to another. Ended up starting Dallas Theological Seminary from the Tampa Bay area, where they were offering some extension sites. And that's the part of the Florida that I lived. And then from there, one thing led to another. A few years later, I found myself with a U-Haul truck fully loaded with all of my stuff, my 2 dogs, my kids, everything else, and moving to Dallas to finish my THM there in Dallas. And then from there, went back to Florida to continue to practice law and do missions. And my missions work at that point was focused in the area of theological education and training, and helping Bible colleges and seminaries in Spanish-speaking countries, especially Cuba, but also other parts of Latin America and even in Spain, some traveling there, using my legal background, my law practice as a way to support this missions habit that the Lord had been developing in me. And then from there, ended up doing a PhD in Latin America in theological education. My family's background is Cuban, so that might tie some of this together for us. So my parents immigrated from Cuba back in the late 1950s as Fidel Castro was taking over the country, the island. And then from there, I grew up in that kind of home and knew Spanish, learned Spanish at a very young age, learned Spanish before English. So the Lord sort of began to bring all this together for me in my life after coming to Christ and studying at Dallas Seminary, doing a PhD. And then from there, Dallas Seminary called me as I was finishing that doctoral work to come here to Dallas Seminary. This is where I am right now. I'm in Dallas. I'm in my office here at DTS, and I was asked to teach in the missions department, but also start the Spanish program here at the master's level at DTS. And then ISET came on a few years later, but that's kind of a little bit of a snapshot, Scott, of how the Lord. Of course, there's so many details we can go into, but that's how I,
Yeah.
in essence, got to the point where I am now.
There's a tension out there in missiology, in the missiological world, as I'm sure you're very well aware of. On the one side, there's those that see the statistics, and there's lots of organizations. One of my good friends, Darren Carlson, with TLI, I mean, they're always putting out big statistics about the need for training
Yeah.
amongst pastors in the global South, particularly, and the huge lack of training. So on one side, you have people that are saying, "Hey, these pastors in these remote places or in the global South need more theological training. There's a lack of it. And so we need to do all that we can to make sure that we get them trained so they're effective in ministry." On the other side of that discussion are those that, I'm probably being overly generalistic on this, but just say, hey, we give them the Bible, we start doing Bible studies together, and between the Bible and the Holy Spirit, they're good to go. And we need to let missionaries kind of back off, let them develop their own way of thinking that is culturally appropriate and isn't muddled up with all of our, North American nonsense. And hey, that's how we're going to get the pure church and how it's going to really spread. So, setting the table with that, what are you seeing in theological education? And and do you see that tension? And how are you trying to approach that question of, do we need more theological education overseas?
We do see, especially in Africa, some in Latin America, some in Asia as well. You're talking about the global South, majority world context. But we do see, and as I visit some of these places, and over the last, in the fall season, I traveled to 7 countries in 4 continents and spent a lot of time with folks that are involved both in formal and non-formal type of theological education and training. But even those within the context, what they seem to be expressing, at least to me, is the need for training theological education that is able to equip pastors to think soundly about the Bible, bibliology, and think soundly about their doctrine and their theology. And in some of these places, you see a more charismatic leaning type of development of pastors. So you might have a young man who maybe graduated from high school, but all of a sudden he's come to Christ in a town or a
Mm-hmm.
small village, and he's the one leading the church. And he's leading it as best as he can, but he has no background in training and formation, and so he's leading this by the Holy Spirit, and we don't want to limit the work of the Holy Spirit. We know that, but at the same time, we need to find a balance between allowing the Holy Spirit to do what He wants to do with these young people that are leading these brand new congregations all over the world, and also balancing that with some biblical theological development and training. And it is not just the biblical and theological training, but there's some practical aspects of ministry that they also need to be aware of. And those things need to come together somehow. The part of the challenge, Scott, also, quite frankly, is that there's not a lack of training materials and training programs. There's a ton of stuff out there. And in some of
Mm-hmm.
my talks, when I go out and speak about this topic, I ask my audience, I say, please do not create a new program, a new curriculum, please, unless you really have assessed why you need to do that. I am always looking at ways to collaborate and share resources and programs with those that are out there already doing it. They've already field tested it. They've already developed it. They've already asked hard questions about their programs. What can we do about collaborating with some of those, and having those that already exist increase their capacity? So if they're able to use their program to train 100 pastors a year, what can we do to come alongside of them and help them now train 500 or 1,000 pastors a year? And so those are some of the questions that come up in my mind as you raise
Mm-hmm.
this very important topic about pastoral training and what do they really need to be effective, and what is the balance between the Holy Spirit work and training.
Well, I think we're on the same page as far as like looking at this need of for training. I can remember, and you probably do too. I mean, you got into ministry a little bit later. I was, right out of Bible college, and there was at that time not everyone was going into seminary, and
Yeah,
it wasn't a foregone conclusion that I would go to seminary. It was kind of last minute decision. Thankfully, I had some mentors that really pushed me that way, but there was an impulse to, hey, you got a Bible college degree, get out there, start doing the work, don't waste time. People are dying and going to hell. Get busy doing
yeah,
God's work. And I'm so thankful that we slowed down just a little bit. I wish I'd even slowed down more, to be honest with you, and been more equipped. But I see that today. I've got young people that I talk to that are just eager to get out and start doing ministry and not taking the time to adequately prepare. I don't think, from what I hear on the field, that the issue is that these pastors aren't wanting to slow down and be equipped. Maybe it is. What are you seeing as some of the issues and barriers for theological training in some of these difficult to reach places or majority world situations where there isn't a Dallas Theological Seminary right around the
yeah.
corner?
Financial is always a big issue, right? How do you equip these folks that are out there as pastors, and how do you pay for it? Do they contribute to it? Many of them cannot. So the financial piece is a limiting access point. I think also the question of contextualization, and how is it that you're offering
Hmm.
material not just with the right illustrations and examples, but with the type of delivery and content that the pastor in the field really is able to grasp it, own it him or
Hmm.
herself, and able to use it within context. So I think that we tend to come into these settings with programs, again, curriculum that we have developed, and we see it as really sound, and it could be. It usually is very sound in terms of a biblical theological foundation, but how transformative is it within context? One of the things that I say about programs and materials is that we need to measure impact beyond what we are actually offering. And what I mean by that is this: as some of my travels recently, what I've picked up on in talking with pastoral leaders that are out there in the field, when you start to press into them a little further, start asking more critical questions about transformative impact of what they've learned and how they've used it, you tend to see that there's some limitations there. There's been little to no impact transformative in their own lives, and then you're asking questions about their churches and the same type of thing,
Hmm.
and society as well. So I am burdened, Scott, recently from my travels in asking the question, to what extent what you're offering is making a transformative impact. Another way of asking the question is, are you doing what you really think you're doing with your materials and your teaching? Okay,
Hmm.
that's a big question. I interact
Yeah.
with hundreds of non-formal programs all over the world. They contact me because of my work here at Dallas Seminary or through ISET, and I sort of interview them. I ask questions about their programs, the materials, how they deliver it, and so on and so forth. My last question usually is, how are you measuring effectiveness in your program? How
Hmm.
are you measuring that you're actually doing what you think you're doing? And I say that up to 98% at least do not do any of that. And I think that when I'm not just talking about quality assurance. I'm not talking about
Right.
accreditation or
Right.
validation or so on. I am asking the question: are we really making lifelong transformative change within those that we're training within their churches or within their contexts? I was talking to a leader of training program in Zambia back in October, early October, and he said to me, he said, Michael, we've been at this for about 12 years, and we're now going back and looking at pastors that we've trained over that period of time, and what we are discovering is that some of them cannot even express a biblical foundation for the gospel. They don't know how to
Hmm.
express it from a biblical basis. And he said, we need to go back and really look at what we're doing and reframe some of that. So I think not so much a barrier, but it is a barrier in terms of doing what we really think we ought to be doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a pastor friend of mine just yesterday, and we were talking. This coming Sunday. I don't think this is when this episode will drop. Maybe it is. But while we're recording, the coming Sunday is Sanctity of Life Sunday, and so I'm thinking about this issue of life, and really, I was trying to go deeper in my thinking about it of just the doctrine of the Imago Dei, and like
Yeah.
why we don't get because we don't get that right, we get so many other things wrong, and when I was talking to him about this and what I was trying to do to with my congregation, and then it hit me. It's like because because I think my spiritual gifting is teaching everything. Teaching is the solution to everything, and like if you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And then
Yeah. Yeah.
my
Yeah.
second thought to him was, I know the solution isn't always teaching, but I also know that the solution isn't less teaching. um, so I think it's important as we think through this theological education that we recognize there's such a need. Teaching alone isn't going to necessarily solve the problem, but is looking at what's the impact, what are you trying to do, how do you measure that? And this is a question. I don't want to get off this topic too much, but like I want to go a little bit deeper in it. Like when you have missionaries that are coming from the outside, and at ABWE we have this. So many of my friends who are in theological education have this,
Sure.
where we have
Sure.
past, like for instance, here I have a little bit of a background in China, in Chinese culture, worked with Muslims. But let's just say you were to bring me to Tanzania to teach, I have very little understanding of what's going on there. How would I
Yeah.
even be able to measure effectiveness and what it looks like, other than what they tell me it's what's happening? So how do you kind of wrestle through that with theological education, of when you've got outsiders doing it? Are they even able to best understand, like, how, if it's impacting? How are you trying to address that problem?
I think one of the ways to address it is simply to look at the begin to look at, and this needs to be measured over time, Scott, as well. There's only so
Mm,
much that you can
hmm.
measure immediately. There's some of
Right.
that, but I would say two things. One is part of moving forward in this area of realizing what kind of impact are we really making in the context and within the pastor's life in the church and so on. Part of it is the mentor or accountability coach or someone who's out in the field, not because what happens oftentimes is that we are very intent on delivering content, but we're
Mm,
short sometimes on caring for the character development.
mm,
And that's where,
mm,
as I speak to again missionaries and mission agencies that have a lot of training material out in the field, and especially in the global south, as we're talking about, this is an area that they find lacking today. If you ask them, they will say, we need more facilitators. We need people that are on the ground with these people that we're training, and walk with them longer than over the course of a weekend or a week or whatever, however we deliver
mhm,
the material. So I think that's an important aspect to it over the shorter term, is having someone that could help assess, at least anecdotally, how they're seeing
mhm,
an impact and changes within those that we're training and teaching. Some of these things, however, you could measure over a longer period of time. So, how are we measuring family, divorce rates, crime, youth? If you look at statistics for youth that are out there, I mean, I hear it again as I travel. Our youth are in deep trouble in many places. Suicide rates, not wanting to be connected to the church, all sorts of other things that are happening with them, and that's the future of the church. That's the future of the church, not just
mm,
here in North America, but worldwide. And there are all sorts of statistics that are out there, and some of these are even kept by the government. So I would say to us, as we're looking at theological education and its real impact on some of these contexts, I would say two things. One is how are we setting up facilitators, mentors, coaches, whatever word you want to use, that will walk with those that we're training, but also how are we able to measure impact, transformative impact within those in the church through means that society is also measuring. So those kind of numbers that I just mentioned a moment ago, the church measures some of that sometimes, but also culture, government, and other entities measure it as well. maybe we need to start looking at some of that and see how we're making progress over time.
That's so important. I mean, and that goes even back to the conversation I was just describing. We were talking about how, you just say a phrase like that we assume in Christian Western society of like abortion is wrong. And we forget that there's layers and layers of theological concepts and philosophy that's built off that and principles that are built off that are all undergirding that principle. And so you have a generation that if we're not teaching those things, and then you have the old gray hairs that are like abortion's wrong, and the young kids are like, why? And they give a million ethical reasons why it's not wrong, and without the theological bolstering that we just assume in our culture because it's built up over time and over lots and lots of teaching. And if we're not continuing to do that, then you don't have anything to hold that idea up. And
Yes.
the same thing would be true in places where the gospel isn't yet, or it's just in infancy. That though that kind of culture, theological ground laying has to be built to produce the kind of life ethic that we would say is a Christian one and reflective of the gospel.
Yeah, and this is something too, Scott, that as I think what we're talking about here, we're talking about training programs and curriculum and so on, but there are a few areas. What I'm seeing is the development of what's called a regional training hubs,
Mm,
where it is not just a singular non-formal training program for a pastor that's involved, but also you have churches in the community. You have probably maybe some Bible colleges, seminaries that are in the area, other ministries that may be involved in the area, and there are some that are starting to create these regional or local hubs where it's a more integrated, a whole view of training of leaders for the church within the context. And what the value of that is touching on your point a moment ago, is that then you have access to some of the more formal training programs and teachers and curriculum that's available through local Bible colleges and seminaries. And I've seen this happen where there's a greater there seems to be a greater movement towards how can we work together, the different sectors of training and theological education. How do we work together better for the sake of the local church and building up future leaders for the church in a more holistic, integral way that's effective over time? And that's I think that's a significant move forward. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of
hmm
interaction and dialogue and community building and trust and relationship building between these different entities or groups or ministries that are involved in these regional hubs. But I think it's a positive way forward, and if we can sustain that over time, we will likely see greater long term impact in these cultures.
So this might be a good time to talk about ISET. So what is that, and how is it trying to help accomplish some of these goals?
ISET is, as you said earlier, stands for the International Council for Evangelical Theological Education. It's been around for 40 plus years. Most of what ISET's mission involves quality and collaboration. How do we pursue quality and collaboration, community building among those that are doing training for the sake of the church everywhere worldwide? And we do that through a number of different ways. One of the greatest ways that we do that is simply by our global gatherings that we've had over time. So we've had 18 global consultations in 40 plus years. The last one was in Izmir, Turkey, November of 2022. We had 500 people plus there from 80 plus countries, representing nearly 300 training ministries from around the world. And on that one, we intentionally focused in on the formal, non-formal topic. So we had a consultation in 2022 that involved the theme was formal and non-formal theological education beyond dialogue. So I said as a place where we certainly look at different areas of quality assurance and what does quality look like in theological education, but also we're very interested in how do we build connectedness and community and collaboration among those that are doing the training. And I said also
Mm,
is it represents 7 regional associations that accredit and not they don't only do accreditation, but they do a number of services for about 1,000 schools around the world, and we represent every region through that. So that's the work that ISET does, and that's I've been the director there since 2019. And it's been a great ministry, and looking forward to seeing what God is going to do as we continue to move forward there.
So from your vantage point, and on recognizing the limitation of that, obviously, but you're very involved, and ISET's very involved. You said 1,000 training centers around the world. I mean, that's incredible when you think about the scope of that. What are
Yeah.
some of the things that you're hearing that really encourage you? If you have stories or places in the world where you're just seeing things happening that bring a lot of joy to you and to the team there, and what are some of the areas that you're like, hey, this is a area of concern?
I was just in Kenya. In Kenya, this was really encouraging, Scott. We had our Africa Association for ISET bring together, and they work together with the Africa Evangelical Alliance as part of the World Evangelical Alliance. It's their African group. So ACTI, which is our African Association, and the Africa Evangelical Alliance came together, and they had a continental-wide gathering on formal and non-formal theological education for Africa. And I attended that gathering. What I found encouraging was the movement towards really candid conversations about what is needed in the field. So there were moments during the event where some that were in the audience, that as we were doing Q&As and so on, some in the audience would stand up and just simply say, we get what you're talking about in terms of education and training, but can I share my story about what we need in the field right now? And some of those moments
Yeah.
opened up meaningful interaction with them. I tend to, and as I traveled over the fall and interacted with a number of people that are doing formal and non-formal training, what I see happening is this greater movement towards candid conversations, openness to explore ways to build community and collaboration. The work that's required, Scott, as we've been talking about, the work that's required to train church leaders around the world nowadays, especially in the global south, that kind of work is not going to get done by
Mm,
any one ministry, any one sector, any one training program. We have to be looking at this from a more collaborative, community-based type of approach, and I see that type of environment developing further, and I'm encouraged by that. And I think ISET plays a vital role in continuing to open up avenues of conversation, avenues of potential collaboration. We don't want to force the collaboration. That's not part of what we do, but we do want to set the table for that and invite the right people to that for that purpose. So I think I see that as a trend globally that
mhm,
is very promising along the way. I think the other part that I find encouraging, but still has a long way to go. As I look at training and theological education globally, uh, too often times it is led by folks that are a little bit older, the older generation of leaders. I want to see us be able to bring in a younger group, an emerging set of leaders, perhaps, and that requires intentionality on our part. And,
mm,
and that to me is a little bit of a challenge. As I go to some of these gatherings, a lot of the people that are speaking, that are leading, are of an older generation. Let's say that. I think we need to be looking at how do we bring in some of the younger ones. Now, I was in Indonesia in the fall, and I was at the WEA, the World Evangelical Alliance's Emerging Leaders Summit. And there were a number of people there from different parts of the world that were younger. I was probably one of the oldest people, my oldest person there. But it
mhm,
was exciting for me to listen to them and interact with them. I had a chance to sit around a table for 3 days in a row with young leaders in different parts, and they were asking me. They wanted to hear from me. They wanted to ask me
mhm.
questions about theological education and training. They were intrigued. But see, those are tables that we need to intentionally set. And I hope that ISET can play a role in that. We have our next global gathering in March of 2025. We will start it online in March of 24, just in a couple of months, and have a year long buildup. But one of the things I'm asking my team to do is how do we bring in younger leaders and have them develop community with us and have an intergenerational approach to theological education and training. There's a lot we can learn from them. There's a lot they can learn from us. But I see that as one of the challenges as I look down the road a little bit. We need to be more intentional with that.
It's interesting. It kind of makes sense. You think about when things slow down, so you have enough time to be involved in something like that. But getting the people to the table, especially in such that kind of a setting, is a challenge. What are some of the
Yeah.
needs you see that are out there? Like, I would imagine financially that there's a need. What are some of the other big needs you're seeing in theological education? If you were to able to wave a magic wand and have all the seminary students in North America sitting in front of you and put a charge in front of them, what would it be?
I think it would be more than anything else to be thinking of your training in a globally mission way. Be thinking about it from a missiological standpoint, and by that I mean, how is it that you're working on, what you intend to do, is really fitting within the missio Dei, the work of God, and how we can
Mhm.
advance that, as opposed to being myopic in your thinking. I think we need to be thinking from a global perspective on what is needed within the church worldwide and what is our role in fitting into that. Now, as I think about that, also though, however, we need to be thinking about what are some of the current realities of the church. One of the things that I do say is that the future of theological education will depend on its ability to understand the current realities and the future troubles of the church. So that
Mm,
sense of connectedness to the church and the current realities. What are some of the issues that the church is really facing in different parts of the world today? Now, a lot of it has to do with government and some political issues that are going on. Some of it has to do with family. Some of it has to do with youth. Some of it has to do with even orality and oral teaching and training. So these are areas that the church is currently facing, and at times theological education is somewhat disconnected from those current realities. Now,
mm,
tied to that as well is looking ahead, future troubles of the church. Theological education and training, and those that are involved, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, they've been rather reactive than proactive. So that requires an extra layer of work and effort, Scott.
mhm,
But not
mhm.
only am I looking for theological education to be able to address current realities, but how can we help the church anticipate what's coming down the road? And how can we help those
Right.
that we're training be equipped to understand those future troubles, as I say? And then the last part related to that as well is just being able to think through how do we develop generational leaders for the church, a movement that is sustainable over time. And that to me, think that to me involves some of this topic, the topic of next generation leaders, emerging leaders, and so on and so forth. But we need to have our pastors and our leaders in our churches be thinking about this in the long term, and that if they're committed to this, let's help them be equipped to be in the ministry for not just 3 or 4 or 5 years, but in the over the course of a long term, and be able to help them do that. And I think theological education has a role to play in that, not only as we train people for the ministry, but also ongoing training and ongoing work that we can do to encourage our pastors and help them continue to stay faithful in the work. So those are some of the things that as I look at the church and as I look at theological education, current realities, future troubles, long-term and generational impact as well.
Yeah, so much of theological training is looking backwards, and necessarily
Yeah.
so. We look back to what theologians have written. We look back to how theological things have developed. We look back to the Bible, and try to understand that world.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. We need to
Yeah,
be doing
no,
that. Yeah, we have to do
right,
that.
and
And that's part of our foundation, our history, of tradition, and so on and so forth. So we have to do that. But as we do that, are we understanding what the current realities are of the churches? And in context will drive some of that too, right? But current realities and what are its future troubles? How do we help anticipate what's coming up now ahead?
yes, and what I'm hearing is we need to look back and build that robust theological knowledge and understanding, so we can look at the present, understand what's happening now, but also have the the leadership vision to be able to look down the road and say, where will this go? And how do we
Yeah.
help prepare the ground for what's coming?
Yeah. The part of the, and let me just say this too, Scott. I mean, what I'm sharing, I think is important and vital for the church to be well served by theological education. Is kind of what I'm saying here. My concern is that most in leadership, especially outside the U.S., most in leadership in theological education today have little margin in their lives as they lead
Mm,
these training programs. They have little margin to be
right.
thinking, not never mind long term of future troubles of the church, but be thinking about current realities. Some of them are trying to address their current needs within the seminary or Bible college. So one
Yeah.
of the things, yeah, and a lot of these leaders of these Bible colleges and seminaries outside the West, and we have the luxury. I have the luxury of having a nice office here at Dallas Seminary. I've got a salary and a library. I have access to all sorts of things. Whereas many key leaders of Bible colleges and seminaries, they don't have any of that, or some of it, but
Right.
little limited. And some of them are multivocational. They might have another job, or they might be pastoring a church, or they might have other cultural layers that also put pressure on their lives that helps to limit their margin. So one
Hmm.
of the things that we're doing in ISET, and I hope to do with our key partners and associates and affiliates of ISET, is helping to create environments where, in times where some of these key leaders are able to sit back a little bit, even pull them out of their seminary for a few days and help them be thinking through not just their colleges and Bible colleges and seminaries, but also what's going on in their context, and how can we help them be create that margin for them a little bit where they can do some of that. But otherwise, I mean, I'll be honest with you. Otherwise, we are going to have a deep struggle globally in theological education if we don't create that kind of margin for our key leaders.
That's beautiful. I love the vision. I'm thankful for what you're doing. And if people want to find out more about you, or they want to find out more about Dallas Seminary, if they want to find out more about ISET, how can they do that?
Well, they can go to our webpage for ISET. It's iset.info. You can do that. Also, you can send me an email at michael.ortiz@iset.info, michael.ortiz@iset.info, or Dallas Seminary here. You can reach me at mortiz@dts.edu.
Thank you so much, Michael. And if you're listening, please reach out. You can see more of the in the liner in the show notes on Instagram. Also, we just encourage you, if this show's a blessing to you in any way, please go to your streaming service of choice and just make sure to go ahead and give us a 5-star review, and review that really helps us get this show out in front of the masses and in front of people that need to find this kind of information. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. And until next time, for the Missions Podcast.